I'm going to now show you the first of the two very powerful filters that you have at your disposal. The first is SED, the second is of course awk, which we'll see in the next module. SED, which is short for Stream Editor, is a program for performing basic editing tasks on the output of another program or on a file. So you can think of a stream, if you like, an actual water stream like a brook, and as the water flows past a certain point it is modified in some way. So that's what SED does. It sits there, and as the text goes through it, it modifies that text according to a set of rules that you specify. Now it can do that, as I said, with the output of a program, or it can do that in fact with a file. But just as we saw with the sort program, the actual file is not changed at all. The output is simply produced on the screen corresponding to the changes that you requested. So in other words, the file doesn't change, you just see the changes on the screen. So if you want to change the file, then you have to use a technique like I just showed you at the end of the sort module. Now SED in its most basic form looks like this. You specify an action that you want to perform, and you specify, optionally, you specify the files that you want to perform the action on. And if you don't specify files, then it performs that action on the input from either the keyboard or from another program. Now I'll show you what the actions are in a moment and how you construct an action, but you can actually perform several actions at a time as follows. You can say either SED -E action 1 or -E action 2, or you can take all the actions that you're wishing to perform and put them into a script file and just say simply SED -F of the script file. So what that will do is SED will open up the script file, examine all the actions in it, and then perform all those actions on the given input. Keep in mind when you're specifying these actions is that these actions almost always contain special characters as far as the shell is concerned, and so you probably want to enclose those actions in single quotes to prevent the shell doing things with those special characters. Having said all that, let's now have a look at the actual actions themselves. The most common action is text substitution, and you can even use regular expressions here to search for the text that you actually want to replace. Now here is an example of an action changing foo to bar. Change the first occurrence of foo on each line to bar. So let's have a look now. Because we've seen what an action might be, an example of an action, let's see SED doing its stuff. So I've got a file here called test file, and I'll just cat it onto the screen. Test file, and again it's the contents, or at least part of the contents of my etc password file. So what I'll do now is I will run SED over this file, and all instances of bash I will change to born again shell. Let's see how that works. So I do a SED. Now enclosed in single quotes I have S for substitute, and I substitute this bash for born again shell, like that, and then the closing slash, and then the closing quote, and then the file is of course called test file. And now everywhere where there was bash, you can now see born again shell. That's a very simple piece of text substitution. Now I'll show you two actions on the same line. We'll do one where it's we'll do -E for that, and then I'll do another one where it's -E, and we'll substitute false for error, if I can spell error right, like that. Now I haven't put any single quotes around that because I don't need to. There's no special characters in there like spaces or asterisks or anything. And this time, instead of the word false, you can now see error on the end of the line there. So that's a simple text substitution, S for substitute, and if you put a G after the end of the second slash there, then it will actually change all the occurrences on each line from foo to bar. Otherwise it will only change the first one. it's possible to specify a range of line numbers to restrict the actions of the substitute or any action that you're specifying. You can say, well, I only want to perform the action on 1, 10. You see the 1, 10 there? That means on lines 1 to 10, they're the only lines that I wish to perform that substitute on. Or alternatively, you could say 40, $. Now the dollar actually means, in this case, the last line of input. So all the way from line 40 to the last line of input, I want you to substitute foo for bar. If you don't specify line numbers, then the actual actions will be performed on every single line of input. Yes, and as I mentioned before, the dollar refers to the last line in the file, or last line in the input, more accurately. The second action, I've shown you one action so far, the action of substituting. Another common action is deleting lines. That is done like so. Delete lines 11 to 20. That's a very simple one. Or alternatively, if you like, /hopscotch/d. Delete all lines with hopscotch in them. Let's have a look at an example of that. So here's my bash example again. This time, instead of substituting one bit of text for another, this time whenever I see the word bash on a line, I'm simply going to delete that line. So all we'll have left are the lines of the text file that do not contain the word bash. And there they are. You can check that if you like, but there's not a word bash on any of those lines. Now, as you can see, there's actually 100 lines in the file called test file. So what I could do is use sed to delete all but the last 2 of them. So I'll delete lines 1 to 98. Let's have a look at that in action. And I just get 2 lines printed on the screen. And it's even possible to delete all the lines except for the lines that match certain criteria. So you can say from line 3 to the end of the file, do not delete those lines. So it will in fact only delete the lines that do not fall into that range. In other words, it will delete lines 1 and 2, and that's all. Let's have a look at that in action. This time I'm just going to display 99, $, which means obviously from the second last line of the file to the last line of the file, I do not want to delete those lines. In fact, I just want to delete the other lines. So again, I see exactly the same 2 lines of output as I saw before. Or you can say, I do not want to delete the lines of text that have the word ducks on them, for example. And if you think about it, that is really similar to what grep does. If you say grep for a certain pattern, then it will actually delete the lines of text that do not contain that pattern on them. Okay, so that's pretty much all I want to show you as far as sed is concerned. I've only shown you 2 actions at the moment, substituting text and deleting text, but those are the 2 most common actions that people use with sed. There are many, many more actions and options available for sed. You should check the man page. But before we move on to the next module, I will actually show you one very interesting thing that you can do with sed. This is a little file that I wrote called sed script. It's actually very similar to a shell script. In fact, except it's not a shell script, it's actually a sed script. When you run this program, and it will be an executable script that you can run like any other executable script, instead of being interpreted by the shell program, it will be interpreted by the sed program. So obviously the lines of code in this script should be sed actions rather than shell script actions. So what are we actually going to do? Well, we're going to substitute mvirtue, which is my username, to be the author of this course. And we're also going to delete any lines that we find in the input that contain the string Gumby. So I'll show you that in action. Let's run the Who program. And you can see that in the Who program, right at the end of the Who program, there is mvirtue, which is me, showing my login details, and then also about halfway down the screen there is Gumby. So now we can say Who, and we can pipe that to sed script, like that, which is an executable program in its own right. And we get the same output again, but you can see that Gumby is no longer there, and the last line, the mvirtue, has been changed to the author of this course. So that's a very nice little thing you can do there. You can create executable sed scripts in their own right. And you can make these quite sophisticated and quite lengthy. Anyway, keep that in mind, and we'll move on to the next chapter.